Thank you, Anna Sophia. Thank you for that warm introduction. It's great to be starting the year with all of you. Before I jump into my slides, I'd love to introduce myself so that you can actually see me on perhaps a bigger screen than if I had my slides up. So my name is Poornima, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. As Anna Sophia mentioned, I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert and specialist. I work with a number of different organizations at different levels, at individual levels, but also at team and organizational levels, with C-suite as well as with managers, to really get individuals, but also the organization, to really put diversity, equity, and inclusion at the top of the agenda when it comes to at this strategy level for the people, strategy for the organization, but also more importantly, thinking about how individuals within the organization can really show up as active allies. That's a big concept that I work with, which I'll be talking about today, really focusing on how we can all show up to create inclusive workplaces for all. So I've been in academia for the past 15 years. And in universities in Singapore, which is where I'm from, as well as here in Copenhagen. I've been with the Copenhagen Business School for the past 6 years, and more recently, actually just taking on a new role within the university as associate professor. So I'm delighted about that. As Anna Sophia mentioned, I'm the author of the book, Diversifying Diversity, Your Guide to Being an Active Ally of Inclusion in the Workplace. And this is really about looking at diversity in its holistic sense, and I'll be talking about that as well. So very, very happy to be here, and I'm going to jump into my slides. If at any point in time you can't hear me or something goes wrong with technology, as it sometimes happens, please just unmute your microphone and just let me know as well. So I will get my slides up, so just give me a moment to do that, and we can get started. All right, good, excellent. So if you could just make sure that your microphones are on mute, that would be great, just so that everyone gets the same experience as well. So today's topic that Anna Sophia and I discussed would be perhaps a great one to start the year off with, is really looking at inclusive leadership. What does that mean? And how do we then use the concept of active allyship to enable us to be that inclusive leader in the organization? Now, whether you're in the a senior leadership team or not, that is immaterial to looking at this idea of inclusive leadership. It is really at whatever level we are, wherever we have an opportunity to lead others, to be able to inspire others and to work with others, that provides us an opportunity really for showing up as an inclusive leader, and then also showing up as an active ally as well. So what is inclusive leadership, right? So this is the newest leadership aspect to join the various different bricks and blocks that we have. So we've got so many different leadership styles out there, and many of you would be familiar with, I'm sure, quite a few of these. And so inclusive leadership is really the latest one to join the block, and it's the one that is perhaps most relevant for the times that we live in. So alongside with sustainability and sustainability related goals is inclusion and ensuring organizations and society actually are as diverse and inclusive for all. So when we talk about inclusive leadership, it's important for us to take perhaps a step back and think about what is inclusion in the very first place. I will come to defining diversity a little bit later on, but starting with inclusion, because that's very much closely related to the idea of inclusive leadership. So inclusion is really about having a culture within an organization where all individuals are treated fairly, where they're treated respectfully, where they have access and equal access to opportunities and resources, where they feel valued, where they feel appreciated, and where they feel a sense of belonging. So there are a number of different things that are going on when it comes to creating a culture of inclusion. And it is certainly not easy. If it was easy, if there was a silver bullet to this, then we'd have inclusive workplaces. This isn't easy, and we'll talk about why that is the case as well. But at the same time, it's an aspirational goal for all of us to be able to work and co-create organizations where there is this true inclusion. One of my most favorite quotes that I use is by Verna Meyer. She's the VP of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix. And while Netflix itself has its own challenges when it comes to diversity and inclusion, she says, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, I don't know about all of you, but for me, at least, even as a young adult, a teenager certainly, and definitely even as a young adult, I've experienced being on the sidelines on the sidelines of a dance floor, not feeling comfortable to want to get on it. And that's the exact feeling we want to avoid in an organizational environment. We want to ensure that anyone who's walking through the doors of our organization feel like they belong, feel that they're included, feel that their voice is valued and respected. And so really thinking about that dance floor is a wonderful way of thinking about how individuals coming into the organization, are they feeling that comfort in the organization to truly be themselves, to bring their whole diverse selves into the organization. So when it comes to inclusive leadership, there are really two dimensions that I place as very, very important and of interest over here. The first is our value that we place on diversity, to what extent the leader believes in the need for diversity in the organization. And the second aspect is around allyship. What is the practice? So it's one thing to believe in it, and that's the first dimension. The other one is to demonstrate behaviors. So practices that the leader demonstrates in supporting diverse individuals and groups in the area of social justice, human rights, and inclusion. So when we bring these two dimensions together, we get a range of different leadership behaviors in the organization. So what we're trying to achieve in organizations is to really enable our leaders to be inclusive leaders, where they not only understand the value of diversity, but that they also demonstrate those behaviors as well. And of course, as you can see from this 2x2 matrix, there are other forms of leadership behaviors that we see when we look at these dimensions. So a leader who doesn't necessarily believe in diversity, believes in homogeneity, sees the benefits of having a homogeneous or a relatively more homogeneous workforce, and one who doesn't necessarily practice allyship behaviors, that's someone who we would refer to as a homogeneous leader. There are also leaders who demonstrate high allyship, but within certain dimensions of diversity that they are comfortable with. And that's what we call tribal leadership. There are also leaders who value diversity, think about the very idea of diversity as being a good one, but not necessarily show up in the day-to-day in demonstrating behaviors for the different various diverse groups in the organization. And that's what we call the pluralistic leader. Ideally, what we want is to nurture inclusive leaderships, where both the leader is both values the diversity, values and understands the need for diversity, but also really, really demonstrate behaviors for various different diverse groups within the organization. So that's really what inclusive leadership is all about. But how does one then become an inclusive leader? This might sound good, but at the end of the day, we need practical things that each one of us can do, where we can show up starting the year 2022 and showing up to be that inclusive leader. So let's start with the first dimension, or the first point of interest or axis of interest, and that's on truly valuing diversity. Many times if I were to ask you this question, what are the dimensions of diversity that come to your mind? Or what are the words that come to your mind when you think of the word diversity? Quite likely you're going to put gender up there, rightfully so. Maybe some might put up ethnicity or culture or skin color perhaps. Maybe some of you may put up age. But there's so many dimensions when it comes to actually looking at diversity. So in my book, I take a look at 12 different dimensions. Now, each of us doesn't show up in our organization in any one of these dimensions. We show up with a diversity thumbprint. I'm certainly a woman of color, and I don't show up as either a woman or a person of color. I show up in that intersectionality of not just those two dimensions, many other dimensions as well. So my journey with diversifying diversity actually began with a very personal but professional story many years ago. It was my first university academic position. And after a few terms into the role, I had received great peer evaluations as well as performance appraisals and student evaluations. And there was an opening to teach a master's level course in the university that I was with at that time. And really excited, went to chat with my head of department at the time. And I was told that I couldn't teach a master's level course until I had more white hair. And so that was symbolic of the fact that I was thought to be too young to be teaching a master's level course. And at that time, this was about 13 years ago, at that time, the only dimensions of diversity people were looking at were gender and ethnicity. right? And as a woman of color, that wasn't the dimensions of diversity I was being discriminated on. It was age, that I was too young for the role. And it didn't matter what my what merits I had, what talent or skills I had, it was all about the age. And so that really began my journey with putting more dimensions on the table and really getting organizations to think beyond gender is important, ethnicity is important, and so are all these other dimensions. And really understanding that our employees show up in this intersectionality between all of these dimensions. There are really three categories over here in front of you. You have the physical and the physiological dimensions, and that includes gender, sexual orientation, one's age, and physical abilities and appearances. The second big block is around cognitive dimensions, and there you have education, experiences, and skills. You've got personality and ways of working, and different ways of thinking and learning as well, also known as neurodiversity. And then you have the last block, which is around social and lifestyle factors. And here you've got ethnicity and culture. And I differentiate that from beliefs and practices because it's not always that our beliefs and practices are tied into our ethnicity and culture. And then you have marital and parenthood choices, and finally the socioeconomic backgrounds that we all come from. Now, if I were to ask you to describe yourself, quite likely you're going to be describing who you are and your background and your experiences, your own personality, what you enjoy, the ways you learn, and that's going to be a more holistic description of you and everyone else that you work with as well. So when individuals and employees show up in our organization, they're showing up in this intersectionality. And so when we talk about diversity, it is so important for us to think about this in a holistic way. Of course, many of these dimensions are not easy to measure or track. And as Anna Sophia alluded to earlier with those wonderful statistics as well, it is much easier for us to measure the number of women organizations, the number of women in senior roles, for example. So gender statistics are certainly one we can measure easily. We can also, depending on where we are in the world and what kind of data we can collect, we can collect data around ethnicity and cultural background or nationality, perhaps. We could even collect data around age as well, again, dependent on where we are in the world and what limitations we have with data collection. But beyond that, if you look at many of the other dimensions of diversity, some of them are quite hard to measure and to track year on year. But that doesn't mean that they're not important, and they're not important for the individual who's coming into the organization and the relationships that they have with other people as well. And that sense and feeling of inclusion, again, is one of those things that's very difficult to measure. Employee engagement surveys are great ways to do it, but does it really give us a sense of how people are feeling? What is that feeling of belonging, right? And that's a very subjective one, but also a very difficult one to measure. So when we think of diversity more holistically, and when our policies and practices encompass these various dimensions in as broad a way as we can within the resources and the commitment levels we have in our organizations, then it helps us to move closer and closer to the idea of creating an organization that is truly inclusive for all. Now, in front of you, I've got just a quick grid to show you kind of that intersectionality in which people show up in organizations, right? So maybe as you look at this, I'll give you just a moment to perhaps take a look at these different identities. Is it someone that you recognize? Maybe it's yourself. Maybe it's a colleague that you work with. Maybe it's someone that reports to you, or someone that you've seen in the organization and maybe thought, okay, that's someone who's different from everyone else. I wonder how that person feels. So just for a moment, take a look and read at this. And as we look at our own diversity thumbprints, it's even beyond just the 2 or 3 dimensions that I'm showing you here in terms of intersectionality. It's even more than that. It's all of those different components, those 12 dimensions that are really coming together. And I'm sure there are even more dimensions beyond that as well. So when we talk about why D&I, I think that's the real emphasis that leaders within organizations need to understand and be clear about for themselves. This is not about someone else necessarily convincing or imposing ideas, but it needs to be an intrinsic belief that diversity and inclusion have a positive benefit for my organization. And that is the true value. That's when the true value of diversity really comes through as well. So when it comes to D&I, the case for D&I is a strong one. Anna Sophia had some data points there earlier for you for what it would take for us to move the needle further and faster. But when we look at financial performance, it's shown the McKinsey report certainly show that teams that have both gender and ethnic diversity are found to be more profitable than those that don't. So there is growing evidence that we can see from the financial standpoint. But perhaps for me, what's most important are the non-financial benefits that come from having diverse and inclusive workplaces. Improved talent management from being able to attract and retain talent as well. We know that the younger generations of Generation Z and Alpha, as they grow, as they come into our workplaces, many of them are demanding diversity. They want to work in environments where they're seeing diverse talent because they know that it creates an environment that is that has synergy, that has energy, that brings together different ways of thinking and learning. And so that improvement in talent management is certainly a big part of the benefits that come from embracing D&I. The other one is really thinking about, and this is an important one, I think, for many organizations, is really thinking about how do we innovate? How do we get better at what we're doing? And how do we think of new ways of doing things? Now, when we think of innovation, we often think of very radical innovation. But really thinking about those smaller, moments of innovation or episodes of innovation that happen by putting people together who are different from each other, who are thinking differently, who bring different perspectives. And those synergistic benefits, that is what is fueling companies forward to think differently, to think out of the box, and to move ahead and really grow, if you'd like. So improving team performance through that improved innovation and creativity as well. The customer base for many organizations is a global one, increasingly so, right? Where if you talked about maybe 60, 70, 80 years ago, companies were focused more internally within their own markets that they were in, their regional markets, maybe at the very most. But these days, companies that are being born and even companies that have been around for even as a century perhaps, are really having to think about their customers as being global customers. And global customers are diverse customers. They are diverse across many of these different dimensions, and they have different needs and different expectations of the companies that they work with, but also the companies that they support as well. And so ensuring that to be able to understand the customer and the diverse customer, it is so important to have that representation even within the organization as well. And finally, we're seeing growing number of organizations that are tying diversity and inclusion metrics towards their ESG. And that is a really positive step in the right direction. The more that we see sustainability as well as D&I metrics up there that is being recognized, then we're going to see that value, of course, increase as well. So there is a strong case for D&I from a leadership level. So if we put together the idea of thinking about diversity more holistically and understanding that there's a true benefit of having diverse talent within the organization, embracing that, but also co-creating that inclusive workplace as well, that there's a real value for the organization. That's the first dimension. The second thing is around thinking about allyship. Now, why allyship? Why is allyship the other dimension? Now, it is not sufficient for us to think only about the value that we place on diversity. We might have that and we might think very highly that, yes, we need diversity, we need to have an inclusive workplace, we know that it's beneficial for the organization, but actions matter. And this is where allyship comes in. So what is allyship? Allyship is the extent to which a person nurtures and cultivates relationships based on trust, based on honesty, authenticity, humility, vulnerability, and accountability with others with whom they do not share diversity dimensions with. So who are the people around you, perhaps in your workplaces, the people that you work with who are different from you across different dimensions, not just gender, not just ethnicity, but all those different dimensions. And how do you nurture those relationships? That's really what allyship is about. Now, when it comes to allyship, there are actually three it's a continuum. There are three stages you could be at. There are some who are on denial, where they don't necessarily believe that allyship is even needed, and in fact work towards and demonstrate behaviors where they support homogeneity. And there are many of us who are more passive allies, where we know the value, we understand it, but we don't know necessarily what we can do. How do we show up to be that active ally? So while we might do small things in small ways, but not necessarily actions that have positive impact on others or larger groups of people as well. Active allyship is the stage that we ideally should be moving towards, and that requires us to have three things. And for us to help us along this journey towards active allyship, we need knowledge. We need to have a good, solid know-how of why we're doing what we're doing, what the benefits are, and really have that knowledge behind us to back us. Because very often in this journey, we're going to be asked questions. We're going to have to sometimes even defend the way we're doing things. And for that, we need to have a solid understanding. Data, of course, helps, but really getting into the nuts and bolts of why we need diversity and inclusion in our organization. The second one is around attitude, and that has a lot to do with deep introspection into understanding that everyone is biased, and therefore we need to make an effort towards understanding our own biases, but also the biases that exist at the team and organizational levels as well. And finally, thinking about behaviors. What are those behaviors that I can do every single day that is frequent, that is consistent, so that I can be that active ally? So over the next few slides, I'm going to share a number of things that you can do on a more practical level. I think it's always nice when we have these kind of sessions that the audience walks away with a set of practical things that you can do. So keeping in mind knowledge, attitude, and behavior, let's get started. So when it comes to knowledge, it's about curiosity and open-mindedness. The world looks very different from different perspectives, and different people will say that the way they think about the world is the right way of looking at it. Now, having that curiosity and open-mindedness to try to understand that there are these different perspectives and why people think the way they do. One of the best ways of increasing know-how is, of course, to read, and there's so many articles, books that are written about diversity and inclusion, short articles as well, longer pieces for those who want to get into more detail, books as well to help you along this journey. One of the things that some of my clients do is they start a weekly meeting with a short article around diversity and inclusion so that it stays on the mind of people within their teams, that it's something that they're constantly thinking about, and then they have a quick discussion around it, things that they can take away from that article, things that they can do in that week as well. So, keeping knowledge at the heart of it, continuously learning and growing, understanding that none of us have full information about everything, but we're on this journey towards learning and having that curiosity as well. The second big chunk is around attitude, and that really is around introspection. Now, before we get into this, I'm going to actually show you a video. So I'm going to get out of my slides and have a video come up for you. This is a wonderful video by Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has had its own challenges when it comes to diversity and inclusion and discrimination as well. But this particular one is a social experiment. So while Coca-Cola may not be necessarily the best brand to talk about this, they're honest and they're open that they have a long way ahead of them. But this particular social experiment is a wonderful one to help us think about our own attitudes. So just give me a moment, please, to get that video up and running for you. It should be on your screen in just a moment. All right, it's coming your way.
As if heavy metal and the band I started with friends.
He's got long hair, but at work he ties it in a ponytail. Probably piercings.
I read a lot of books. I read cognitive psychology, behavioral science. I've spoken at TED Talks.
Really? Wow.
You look nerdy. Like you think you're cool, but you're still a nerd. أكثر شيء مركز عليها التراث الإماراتي واللغة العربية.
He's an Arab. And I also think he's wearing a kandor.
Yeah, even I felt that, yeah.
أنا وايد أحب الطبخ. دائما يعني معظم وقتي أطبخ في المطبخ. طبعا يعني في المطبخ.
He's mature, like he's like cheddar cheese.
You mean basically معفن. Extreme sports athlete. I skydive and pretty high risk activity for sure.
Because your actions speak louder than words, right? Yeah.
God, dude, that's awesome.
لا هوني surprise.
It was amazing when the lights came on and you get to realize
who you're actually conversing with.
واستغربت اول شيء لان اول شيء فتحت الايتات الحمراء وما رحت بس اشوف واحد جالس قدامي وكلها تاتوز على وجهه.
This was my expectation of you. This is what you really are.
شفت شخص مثل هذا الطريق ما بعد تكلم وياه.
You guys should be swapped. I didn't expect that.
The rocker was someone who I wouldn't expect to be, you know, a heavy metal musician.
I should have these tattoos, not you, man.
Change.
الشاب اللي قبالي براسي كنت راسم صورة إنه هو راح يكون عربي كثير شكله. That's how you love my
When I saw Garrett on a wheelchair, I was completely taken aback. Hey man, come on.
لما جت العلبة فتحته ما مكتوب عليه شيء، ما مكتوب عليه كوكاكولا.
And the minute I turned around, I saw that
labels أو الشعار أو المغلف أو التصميم هو بس للعلب مش للناس.
ترى واضحة، يعني المفروض ما تحكم على الواحد بالشكل.
الشخص مو بلازم يعني ننتقده بشكله، لكن اول شيء نتعرف عليه عقب نقدر نقول كيف الشخص.
it changes your mind, your perspective, your heart.
I hope you enjoyed that video. I think it's a video that resonates quite well with many people in terms of thinking about our own attitudes towards others. It's we don't often think about it, but it just takes 7 seconds for us to form an impression about others, a prejudice or a stereotype about others. We put people in boxes very quickly. I can share a story that I've written in my book as well, about how natural this process actually is. I was on the beach in Nice in France. This was pre-pandemic, a couple of summers ago, and I had been in the water with my children. I have 2 boys, and they were about 8 and 6 at the time. And I'd been in the water with the children, and my husband was playing with them. For those of you who have kids of your own, or perhaps have taken care of children, young children, you know how precious even 20 minutes is of peace and quiet. So my husband was in the water with the kids, and I was delighted to have this 20 minutes, and I knew it was about 20 minutes. It's never more than that. So I got myself a glass of wine, and I had a book that I was reading, and I was settling myself down on the deck chair, ready to enjoy that peace and quiet. And then the lifeguard came up to me, and he asked me if my children would like one of those long swim noodle things. And I said, absolutely, I'm sure they'll be delighted to. My husband's in the water. And then he proceeded to ask me this question. So where are you from? Now, we had driven down from Denmark, and by that time I was down to about 18 minutes of my peace and quiet. And so I said, oh, we're from Denmark. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, no, we've driven down from Denmark. And then he looked at me very puzzled and said, no, but you're not from Denmark. And so I then said, well, probably in his mind, he was thinking that someone who's a Danish woman would be blonde, would be white, would have blue eyes, and would probably be tall. And I know you can't see me height-wise right now, but I'm none of those things. And so in his mind, I didn't fit the box that a Danish woman would fit into or should fit into. And so he proceeded to then ask me the second question. Where are you actually from? And then I said, well, I'm from Singapore. And that's true. From the age of 4, Singapore has been home for me. And that's where I grew up. That's the home that I know. But he looked very puzzled because probably in his mind, he's thinking that Singapore, probably the person would look more oriental, perhaps from Japan, Korea, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, but I didn't fit that either somehow. And so I didn't fit into that box either. And so he had this really puzzled look. And before he asked me that question for the 3rd time, I decided to tell him, well, I'm ethnically Indian. My family is from India. And then he got really excited. He's like, you're Indian. There's a really nice Indian restaurant down the road that you must try. Now, he meant nothing malicious by this. There was no ill intent in any of those questions. But in asking those questions repeatedly, it demonstrated that I probably didn't fit into the mold of what he thought I would fit into or where I was from. He wanted to build a personal connection with me about that restaurant. He probably had in his mind, she must be Indian, Pakistani, it's from somewhere there, and therefore I will suggest this restaurant to her. It'll be a nice connection that I'm making. And I'm sure he didn't mean anything negative by it, but in that moment, he was not convinced about where I was from. And that, for me, while it may not have had any detrimental impact on him, it made sure that I didn't feel included on that beach in that moment. So when we think about attitudes, and as demonstrated in the video, the biggest barrier we have, and as Anna Sophia talked about earlier, those statistics that are glaring at us, right? 99 years, now 135 years before we get to gender parity. Now, when we look at these data points, what is the biggest barrier that we have? And that's really around bias, right? And bias is an inclination or prejudice for or against one group or person in a way that is considered to be unfair. The thing about bias is we hold biases at the individual levels, but we also hold biases at the collective level, either as teams or as organizations as well. We can also hold bias at the societal level as well. Now, biases can be conscious. They can be those that we're very aware of, that we're holding a bias, a stereotype, or a prejudice. We're very aware of it. But there can also be biases that we have no idea about, that they're unconscious. And until they're pointed out to us, or until we become more heightened and aware, we just simply don't realize that we're holding those biases. And the last one, of course, is that there can be biases that are systemic in nature, that are in the ways that we do things, the ways that things have always been done, the processes and the procedures that are there within organizations as well. Now, when we look at bias in this way, it seems really complex. The thing about bias is, for most of us as individuals, biases are developed over time, right? It takes a long time for us to develop biases through social conditioning, through the experiences and life experiences that we have had. We develop these biases. The challenge for us is, how do we unpack these biases? The reality, though, is that if you have a brain, you are biased. And our brain receives 11 million bits of information every single moment. Every single second, we receive 11 million bits of information. If we were to consciously process all of that information, it would be so cognitively overwhelming for our brain. And therefore, our brain uses heuristics, it uses algorithms, it uses past experiences to help us make sense of this 11 million bits of information. Now, these heuristics and algorithms are great when we are faced with life-threatening situations, or when we're trying to cross the zebra crossing, perhaps, or if we are facing, if you humor me for a moment and imagine that we were all cave people and there was a big animal in front of us, ready and pouncing to attack us. Now, if we started processing all that 11 million bits of information, we would absolutely be feed for that animal, right? So when it comes to gut instinctive decision making, we certainly use these heuristics and algorithms, but we often rely on them when we meet people, when we interact with people, when we make decisions about roles and responsibilities and hiring and promotion decisions as well. The reality, what is really humbling, I think, is that if we recognize that everyone is biased, I think it allows us to be vulnerable, and it allows us to show up in the workplace knowing that it's not just me who's biased, but everyone is. And therefore, people will make errors, they will make mistakes, they will engage in biased conversations and biased decision making. So how do we enable each other to move forward through this? And that's only through to enable us to become more aware of these biases that we hold. Now, biases come from many different areas. Now, we're often very familiar with sexism, racism, homophobia, but there are many different types of biases. Some of them on this list you might be familiar with, others you might not necessarily be familiar with. I mean, there is a bias against with relation to someone's height. It's shown that leaders in organizations tend to be a certain percentage of height taller than other people in the organization. There's biases against someone's hair, right? The kind of hair that people, natural hair that people are born with. There's also biases against someone's abilities or how they look as well, or the food that they eat, perhaps. Our biases come from many, many different areas and different factors, and they all relate to those various dimensions of diversity that we were looking at earlier. One of the things is that we've become more politically correct. We've become a bit more careful in the things that we say and the things that we do. But sometimes biases are hidden as microaggressions. And microaggressions are indirect, unintentional expressions of biases. And these make the other person feel undervalued, unappreciated, and generally offended. The challenge with microaggressions is that the person who's receiving the microaggression may not even recognize it, because we're so socially conditioned into thinking that that's just what people say. That's just how things are. So this lifeguard on the beach certainly didn't mean any malicious intent by asking me the second and the third time where I was actually from. But in asking that question, it demonstrated that he wasn't convinced of where I was saying I was from. And those are the boxes that we want to put people into, that makes us feel safe, but doesn't necessarily make them feel included. So here are a couple of microaggressions that you might have experienced yourself, perhaps, or that where you might have actually said this to others. I know I have been guilty of some of this in the past as well, and it's about reflecting, it's about awareness, it's about making sure that those microaggressions do not get communicated in the future as well. So I'll be sharing these slides later so you can have some opportunities to reflect on this as well. The final block that I have for you before I take some questions is around behavior, right? How do we show up every single day as an active ally? The first one is around inclusive communication. Our words do matter, and we do use words that can be interpreted in different ways. And it's so important for us to think about, for example, the pronouns that we use when we're interacting with other people, the gendered language that we use, language that implies abilities that are needed that perhaps someone in a wheelchair may not have. So what is the language that we're using, for example, in job descriptions as we put it out there? Is the language, or are the words that we're using in preventing certain groups of people from applying from the job itself? And is that why perhaps we're not seeing that diverse representation in our organizations? So thinking about the words that we're using, whether it's in a job description, whether it's in emails, whether it's in what we're communicating as well. And this helps us to avoid those microaggressions as well. The next one is to undergo continuous training and introspection to unpack biases. Many organizations set up unconscious bias training as a one-off. The reality is that it's taken us all these decades to lather on all these biases. It will take time for us to unpack these biases. And that needs to be an understanding of individuals and organizations that debiasing, what is called debiasing, is something that really is a longitudinal process. It's a process that will take time. And continuous training, continuous reflection is the best way to enable this to happen. One of the things that I encourage leaders and organizations to do is to find a bias compass circle. People that you're comfortable with, people that you feel that you can be vulnerable with, who come and bring different perspectives together, and who can then check your biases for you. So if you're making a decision, if you're giving a speech, if you're writing something to a large audience in the organization, get a team together, what you call as your bias compass circle, to check that, to do a sanity check of biases, to make sure that things that you have written, things that you're saying, the decision that you're taking isn't a biased one, or is limiting the biases as much as possible. So find your bias compass circle. Remember that they do have to be people that you are comfortable with, that you don't mind being vulnerable with, where you don't mind your biases being pointed out to you. Now, when we experience and witness biases, or microaggressions, we really have three options at that point in time. And I'm sure that all of us on this call have either witnessed or experienced biases at some point in our lives. So we can do nothing. We can choose to ignore that situation. And sometimes, depending on what situation we're in, that might be the only option available to us. We could call it out or in at that moment. Calling out is more of an aggressive response to it, and calling in is a little bit more subtle and nuanced response to it. But either way, addressing it at that moment is something we could do. We could also address it at a different point in time, maybe taking the person aside and having a one-to-one conversation with them. These are the three options that we have available to us. One of the things that we can keep in mind, sorry, I'm just going to go back to that slide. One of the things that we can keep in mind is how do we address these biases when we witness or experience them? And here I have a strategy called the empathetic questioning. Now, when someone seems to suggest that they are biased, when they make a comment that is biased, and sometimes it could be hidden as humor, when someone makes a joke perhaps over lunch or at the coffee machine, what do you do? How do you react? And most of the time we don't know what to do, and therefore we do nothing. Now, one of the greatest strategies we have is the power of questions. Now, we can ask questions. So, hey, that's interesting that you say that. Why did you say that? You made that joke earlier. I'm curious to understand where that was coming from. Could you tell me a little bit more about these decisions that you have arrived at? I'm keen to understand the process that you went through. In asking these questions, it requires the other person to explain, elaborate, and justify their rationale and reasoning. And in that process, hopefully, without you even needing to point it out, hopefully their own biases get illuminated. Just remember that we also need to take a hard look at ourselves and the decisions that we're making and ask ourselves as well these very questions to ensure that the decisions and the actions and the words and the behaviors that we are demonstrating are also as less biased as possible. And for those of us who are in positions where we have the opportunity to mentor, to sponsor, to lift others, how much are we doing of that? How much are we ensuring that we are able to lift those who need that lift, who need a seat at the table, who need opportunities, who need their name to come up when decisions are being made about promotions or on hiring decisions as well? Making a little space for others is really one of the things that the leaders can do to ensure that we have more diversity at all levels, including at the top of organizations as well. A couple of other things is nurturing psychological safety. Now, psychological safety is when an environment and a team, an organization has a culture where it's all right to make mistakes, that it's all right to point out each other's biases without it having a negative consequence. So how do we create this psychological safety within our workplaces where people are able to allow themselves to be vulnerable and don't mind others pointing out their biases? This is a process. It takes time, but it starts with leaders demonstrating themselves being vulnerable, allowing themselves to be vulnerable as well, and engaging in honest and open conversations. The companies that are able to push the agenda further and faster when it comes to diversity and inclusion are also the companies that are open with the challenges that they face, and they're honest about their own stage that they're in this journey towards D&I. And I think that that's an important place to start at leadership, but also in the rest of the organization, rethinking about what forums we have where we can have these honest and open conversations about why we are not where we'd like to be. And that's a fundamental thing. It ties, of course, back to psychological safety as well, to allow an environment and create an environment where someone can engage in these honest and open conversations. And finally, of course, thinking at the organizational level in terms of systemic biases and where they are in our systems and our policies and practices. And three areas that I think companies can really start with is around recruitment and promotion, in the products and services that they have, in even design for companies that are involved in designing products as well, and then in how these products and services are actually marketed. And these are three areas where they're easier than many other areas to start with, but they also have the greatest impact, which is most important as well. So that's what I had planned for today. And if you're interested to find out more around diversity, this is my book. It's available on Amazon, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'll get out of the screen sharing mode, and I would love to see your faces as well. This morning, I've been just looking at a small little screen, so it'd be really nice if you can switch on your camera, and I'm very happy to take any questions for the next about 12 minutes that we have of your time. So Anna Sophia has very kindly agreed to moderate perhaps this session. So does anyone have any questions?
I will indeed. Do we have any questions out there? Not at the moment. So while you're thinking about a question for Poornima, I have one for you. When we look at the gender gap report I talked about previously, we're in Denmark, it dropped to a 29th ranking, where when we look at our Nordic companies, our Nordic neighbors, we have Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden in top 5. So could you maybe elaborate on why are we in Denmark on a rating number 29 compared to our Nordic neighbors?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. It's a hot topic right now, right? Denmark was up there a number of years ago and one of the top 5. And so what has changed in the environment as such? I think one of the things that we need to really take a look at, I think there's it's a complex situation, and it's multiple things that come together to as people are looking at these rankings as well. But one of the things that we really need to focus on, and even in the countries that are in the top 4, I would say the same thing, is really allowing us to look and be vulnerable and explore biases. A lot of our decisions for why we're not seeing talent, diverse talent, including women, at these senior roles is because we are relying on the things that have always been done a particular way, that we're not introspecting sufficiently around affinity bias. So we hire people who fit into a particular mold or prototype that we like, right? So I often challenge leaders to say, let's remove the word fit. Hiring for fit is perhaps the biggest mistake. Those are 3 words that you don't ever want to see in your organization. If you start hearing people saying, oh, that person fit well with our organization or our culture, those are alarm bells. They should be ringing. There should be red sirens going on in your head. Because what does fit mean? Are we hiring for the same person who looks like someone else, or someone who fits in with what the culture is and how people are similar to each other? So this is one of the things that we really need to take a look at, that biases, what is the role of biases, and hiring for fit and moving away from that. I think that's one of the first things, and that will really change when we move away from hiring for fit.
Thank you, Poornima. Arzu Akar, you have a question, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Poornima, for a really nice presentation. What I'm worried about is obviously the people that have joined the session today are obviously the people that also acknowledge that, you know, there are some changes that needed to happen. How do we get the people that we want to reach to also enter this dialogue? I mean, that's where I see the biggest challenge.
Absolutely. We don't have everyone on board. And more often than not, we have the underrepresented groups on board and members of the underrepresented groups on board, much more than we have the majority. And if we want to move the needle further and faster, we have to get the majority on board. And in organizations, that comes from a business need. How do we tie diversity and inclusion to the business need? Now, we can all say it's the right thing to do. And deep down in my heart, being inclusive and diverse is the right thing to do. But convincing the majority to come on board, that's not sufficient, unfortunately. We don't live in that world. Maybe our children will, maybe our grandchildren will, but we don't live in that world. And so for now, we have to use the business case. The business case is the most important one. Every organization needs to discover and do a good audit of what the business case looks like for them. Right? And once that is solid and convincing, it will get people on board. The second thing I'd say is that leaders matter, and you need champions of this, right? And you need champions in the majority groups. You need champions in the underrepresented, because they are the ones who understand what the lack of inclusion looks like, right? But the burden should not be put on underrepresented groups. The majority needs to step up. Even if it's a handful, that is the starting point of moving this forward, this discussion forward. I think the third thing is, and it's perhaps the hardest thing, Arzu, is acknowledging our own, that the journey that we're all on as individuals when we show up at work is different. The racetrack looks different. Our privileges mean each one of us on this call, I'm sure, has some degree of privilege. And that allows the racetrack to be less cluttered or bouldered, or the rocks are less or smaller, right, compared to someone else. And when we put ourselves in other people's situations, that can be an eye-opening opportunity for people to recognize that the journey is not the same. So having and creating opportunities where people are engaging with others who are different from them, who have different backgrounds from them, who have different life experiences, in an environment that is safe, where they can share, can be just a moment of revelation. It can be a moment where they're going, oh my gosh, I never thought of this way. And that can be quite a humbling but life-changing experience. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Poornima. We have Anas Hawahalt asking a question. Could you maybe turn on your camera if you feel comfortable?
I would, but I just switched to my phone, so it's going to be a blurry, shaky image. Sorry for that one. I think Asu asked a really good question, and maybe it's sort of a follow-up to that, probably from a bit of a negative perspective in somewhat. As Asu said, everybody here, I think, more or less agrees with what you said and can see all the positives outcome from having a more diverse company and having more diverse teams in your company. What would you see as some of the, maybe not downsides, but maybe some of the pitfalls in the transition into that, into having the more diverse cultures in the companies?
Yeah, so I have a couple of them, right? For me, that are things that I look out for in, if you'd like, the sincerity of organizations or their ability to move the needle further, right, for themselves. One of the things that for me is a downside is pigeonholing into any one dimension of diversity. Many organizations tend to focus on gender, and absolutely gender is right up there and is important, but very often we get focused on the quotas and the numbers without thinking about the inclusion part of it. And when you have quotas and numbers and targets, there's a challenge that comes with that. And that is the person or the people who are being put into these positions end up feeling like tokens. They're the tick box, right? That fill that quota. And then you have a danger, right? In Norway, when they increased the number of representation of women on boards, the women who joined the boards were known as the golden skirt girls. Not women, but girls. Because they were there to fulfill the government's requirement for 40%. Now, don't ask me why it's 40% and not 50%, but 40% quota of having women there. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is that while gender is the easiest one to measure, it pigeonholes us and it prevents us from truly creating inclusive organizations based on merit, based on talent, and moving away from the quota system. So for me, quotas are a big issue. The longer they stay in organizations, the more challenging they are. Melinda Gates has a great view on quotas, and she says quotas are great if they're for the short term. There needs to be an expiry date on quotas. And so, yes, it helps us to move things along, but there needs to come a time when the culture and the systemic biases are addressed in the organization where the need for quotas gets removed. And no person should ever feel that they're put into a position where they are that token or that representation. So for me, and as I think one of the biggest challenges, downsides of this journey is we look too narrowly at diversity, and we need to expand that, and hence the title of my book, Diversifying Diversity. And until we do that, that's going to be a challenge. The other thing that I think is, you're absolutely right. Both you and Arzu have said, those of you on this call are the champions, those who believe in it. How do we get the majority on board, right? And I come back to what I said earlier, is we need to convince, and we need to have a pretty strong and convincing argument. For most people in organizations, that ties into the business case. What is the business case for this? And if they can see a positive benefit to themselves. But also people need support. They need support through this journey, because we're all socially conditioned. Each one of us is socially conditioned into being comfortable in certain settings with certain people and not others. How do we provide that support? How do we provide the opportunities for people to get the tools that they can and that they need to be able to interact with people who are different? And so those are a couple of things that come to my mind right now, Anders. I hope that helps.
But Poornima, I worked with Coloplast in my previous job, and they acknowledge that there's a huge business case in order of implementing D&I in the organization. So they actually created KPIs for all management where they're measured on age, culture, and gender. So I agree with you that it's too narrow to think about gender, but I also think that if we have to create some kind of impact, we have to, affect the managers or the directors' KPIs and bonuses and whatnot in order to make a difference. So I think there's a movement on its way, but it takes bravery in organizations to actually measure their managers on the factors of gender and culture and ethnicity and age and so on.
I think there's nothing wrong with measuring any of these, as long as there's a clear understanding that diversity is much more than this.
Yes.
Right? And that when managers also need to be, when they're making decisions, not just be looking at those 3 dimensions, for example, that they're also looking at who can they hire who's neurodiverse, who can they hire who has a different personality profile perhaps from the rest, Who can they hire that might have a different socioeconomic background from someone else, right? So how do we keep kind of the other dimensions of diversity very much in our mind, the dimensions that are not obvious, right? The dimensions that are obvious, we are possibly already measuring in some way or the other, or we're tracking, or we're asking our managers and our leaders, and we're tying their performance to these KPIs. That's fantastic, but it's also important for us to make sure that our managers understand that diversity is so much more. So when they're looking out, they're also looking out for the invisible dimensions of diversity. And that then creates that wonderful synergy internally of innovation, of creativity, of different perspectives that goes beyond the surface level or the visible dimensions. And I think that's where the true value comes in, right? So again, yes, the business case is obvious, but is the business case related to any of these visible dimensions? How do we create a business case for the invisible dimensions? How do we ensure that that is very much emphasized as we think about it? So are we thinking of different ways of thinking and learning, different personality types? Are we thinking about sexual orientation, for example? Do we have an environment where employees feel comfortable? I think within the Nordic context, you could argue that many of our companies are quite inclusive to those with across the sexual orientation identities. But when we look more globally, that's not necessarily the case. And for companies that are global, this is a challenge, right? Because they're, while they might be headquartered here and be doing well in some dimensions, that's not the case necessarily elsewhere as well. So I think there needs to be both. Yes, I agree on the KPIs, but keeping the whole in mind. Yes.
Thank you so much, Poornima. It's been wonderful, and we could talk about this for hours and hours. I would like to say to the audience that you should look into Poornima's book, Diversifying Diversity, and I think we have to mention it, but Andler, they actually said that this book is one of the books that every entrepreneur should read in 2022. And she's, on the shelf with Simon Sinek's Why and Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. So I'm very proud, Poornima. It's very well done. So congratulations on that.
Thank you,
and
Anna.
Then I would like to just tease our next 2 inspirational talks as well. Now we have you here. February 9th, we have the CEO of BCG Pessinium, Christian Gabe, talking about bionic companies, which is a new thing we need to know about. So please note that down. And the 9th of March, we have Imran Rashid talking about feelability. So how we lost touch with our lives and how we can get it back. So that sounds pretty important, I think. But thank you so much for being with us this morning. And thank you, Poornima, again.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day, everyone.
You too. Ciao.
Bye.